All right. So, but first of all, there's a lot of international guests in the room. Does everybody know Eurelectric? Let me see a show of hands. Well, we have at least 3 people that know my organization. I'm flattered today. So, Eurelectric is the trade body of the European power sector. We represent 3,500 companies across Europe. Why so many? Because there are not that many big utilities. We have a huge amount of small and medium-sized grid operators in Europe. We represent the interests of the electricity industry towards policymakers in Brussels, it's a sector that has an annual turnover of more than 500 billion euros, so it's a big part of the European economy. Now, the last 5 years, looking at the European level, we've seen historical change. We've had a historically intense period with loads of legislation. I'm sure you're all more or less familiar with the clean energy package, the targets that have been set, the legislation in the transport area, and so on and so forth, revision of the ETS. But as everything seems, we're going to have another 5 historically intense years. As we sit here today, Ms. von der Leyen is going to unveil her team in Brussels around noon today. We have a good idea of what she's going to present, but we already know that she's going to be very much focused on driving the climate agenda to new levels of ambition. She's announced in her political guidelines a new long-term target, a climate law, setting in legislation a target of net neutrality, climate neutrality by 2050, a review of the 2030 ambition, additional measures in the transport sector, additional financing measures, and so on and so forth. So we're going to have another 5 very, very busy years. The European power sector largely welcomes this agenda. We think it's the right direction because we are, as you can see, also on a very good track. So Donald Trump helped me develop this, this chart. Actually, even if we just look at the real figures and don't sharpen the story, we have a very good evolution in the European power mix. If you look back in 2010, you see a majority of fossil fuels. Already in 2018, we see 60% fossil-free generation, 30% renewables, 30% or 26%, 32% to be very precise, renewables and 26% nuclear. And this is set to continue. If we look at 2030, we're talking about 75% of all electricity in Europe being carbon-free. And if we look at the last quarter, we're also going to see change in the balance between coal and gas, significant change. Sandbag, the European NGO watching the power sector, brought out a report just this summer that was called The Collapse of Coal, which basically looked at the last half year of what's been happening in the power sector. Coal production is dropping off a cliff for many reasons. Higher ETS price, but most importantly because the companies are changing their strategies. If you look at the big companies, they signed up to a very ambitious vision in Eurelectric, but they also basically are seeing a different business model emerge. They are shifting their priorities to other types of energy. So also in the last quarter, we're going to see some significant changes and reductions of CO2. So we're on a good track. If we want to go all the way, and Eurelectric has been very clear that we want to lead the way towards a clean power system and towards delivering on the Paris Agreement. And we've said we want to become carbon neutral well before mid-century. Now, we had McKinsey help us develop an analysis of what that would imply. And if we look at those figures, let's take the right-hand side, which is a scenario bringing us to a 95% decarbonization of the economy, that is exclusive agriculture, by 2045. We would have to, first of all, of course, decarbonize the power sector fully by that time. Secondly, we'd need to double the output because all the other sectors will require clean electricity to decarbonize their systems. And now, when we look at these graphs, it's always feels so convenient. It's absolutely doable. You just need to add a little bit of the green stuff on top, and then everything is kosher. These are non-trivial numbers. The offshore wind on top is orders of magnitude 400 gigawatts by 2045. Today we have 20. And so you see, this is a very significant scale up. I'm sure you're familiar with the discussions about the deployment of onshore wind. The German market is seeing a bit of trouble due to permitting, due to public acceptance. So we have a lot of work in front of us. The sector is committed to do it, but we also know that we're looking at some very, very ambitious trajectories here. What we also know is that we're going to require a lot of investments. Ballpark figures, regardless of the scenario, we're talking for generation and storage around 100 billion euros per year, every year from now until 2045. 100 billion is a lot of money. It's also a significant ramp up of what we have today, but it's also, I don't want to be scaremongering, because you know, when you take these European figures, they always look very big. It's the product of 28 countries doing something together, and it's all about really what you compare it to. These are the annual imports of fossil fuels in Europe. So you can see, yes, it's a lot of money, but if we do things smart and we basically spend our money on something else, we can also, this is also within the remit of the possible. So let's not underestimate this challenge. Let's not be intimidated by it. That's my message. So that's the power sector. As I said, electrification is going to be key to deliver on the long-term ambitions of a climate-neutral Europe by 2050. Here is the breakdown of what is needed in the other sectors when it comes to direct electrification. By direct electrification, we mean basically shifting other energy vectors directly and replacing them with electricity. Today in transport, and that is the entire transport segment, including also the hard-to-abate parts of transport, we have around 1% of electricity. We need to move that to by 2050 to 63%. And mind you, that means a total electrification of passenger cars. The 63% is because you can't fully electrify aviation, maritime, and so on and so forth. So we have a long way to go in electrification of transport. Buildings, we're starting from a higher baseline. Industry also needs to go a significant part of the way. But all in all, we believe in Eurelectric, based on our analysis, that a full decarbonization of the European economy would require 60% direct electrification by 2050. On top of the direct electrification, we also need what we call indirect electrification. That is gases or liquid fuels based on clean electricity. That's going to play a role as well, and there's a lot of talk. We heard the last speaker about sector coupling these days in Europe. We think sector coupling is a good thing. In fact, our sector is already coupled to a lot of sectors, so it's really about recoupling. And we also feel that sometimes the debate in the EU is focusing too much on the electricity-gas nexus. We think that district heating systems are underrepresented in this debate. We think it's a very, very important thing to look at how we rewire and reconnect district heating systems with clean electricity. That's also a key task of this sector coupling exercise. So this is something we're pushing along with good friends in Brussels, amongst others, Euroheat and Power. Now, what you see here is that on top of the electricity required for direct electrification, you're going to have electricity consumption from this indirect electrification coming on top of that. Another key dimension, of course, of smart energy systems is digitalization. I personally believe that digitalization is going to be perhaps one of the most, if not the most, fundamental shift in operations in our sector. We're already seeing, we've been talking about smart grids for how many years? 20 years, 25 years. Some of the grids weren't all that smart after all, and it took a lot of time to smarten them up. We're also seeing now that things are fundamentally changing. We're seeing some significant changes in the nature of the technologies we're using. The AI technologies that we're seeing enter the market now have a very radical potential to change things. And we're seeing blockchain gradually pick up and find use cases across different segments in our value chain. So we see a lot of potential for this. We also see some dilemmas, frankly, when we move further into the future. For example, the implication of increasing digital steer and management of systems also provides us with some very difficult questions over cybersecurity. These need to be handled, and we have to look at this, let's say, through an industrial perspective, from an industrial perspective, but also through a legislative lens, because we're going to have some very, very difficult things coming at us if people hack our systems and basically are able to shut them down. So I want to round up by saying that I also have 3 Ps. They're almost the same, not quite. I tend to talk about people, partners, and pace. The people is the critical need for engaging people in the energy transition. It's not only policymakers, we have those engaged. It's not only the industry people, we have those engaged. It's really about all of us. It's about all the millions of people that need to buy an electric car in the next 10 years. All the millions of people that need to insulate their houses in the next 10 years, all the millions of people that we need to engage somehow in all this DSR in order to make the electricity system ready for a future with a more flexible supply. We've engaged in that journey. We've set up workshops in 8 or 9 member states. We're going to work with BBC to basically survey people next year to see what are the barriers that are holding back engagement, public engagement in the energy transition. So people is absolutely crucial. There's also another dimension to people, which is about the losers, frankly. We're going to see some regions that are going to opt out of coal the next 10 years. And it's not like Starbucks and Google are just waiting to jump into those communities. So we're going to see some pretty significant distributional effects of the next stages of the energy transition. It's absolutely crucial that we tackle those. Same goes for the car industry, by the way. An electric car is great because it's more efficient, it's smarter, it's better. It's also easier to construe, and we will need fewer people to construe cars in the future, frankly. So there will be some very, very significant changes also in the car industry when it comes to employment. Tackling these and making this a fair transition also for the people that are not the immediate winners is going to be absolutely crucial for success. The other P, my other P, is partners. Because as I've shown you, we're on track in the power sector, but our next stage, the next stage of the energy transition for us is all about reaching out, engaging with the other sectors, doing stuff in mobility, doing stuff in heating, doing stuff in industry. Last week, we announced a historical partnership with ASEA, the European car manufacturers, and the Transport and Environment, the most prominent NGO in the space, calling together for a right to plug as a fundamental principle for people not to be bothered with all this, where can I charge my car, and my landlord doesn't want to, and blah, blah. We need to have a seamless transition to an electric transport mode, and it needs to be easy and attractive for people to make that shift. So partners will be absolutely crucial, and new types of partners. It's not only about industry partnerships, it's also about public-private partnerships that are going to look different. It's also about this cooperation between parts of the energy system that haven't been talking so much together as they used to. My last P is pace. As I said, we're committed in the electricity industry. We're committed to go first and go faster. The question is, how fast can we go as a society? The discussion we're having in the EU right now, net zero by 2050, is very, very ambitious, in my view. It's doable. The question is, how deep can you go in 10 years? So Ms. von der Leyen has put 50% on the table, if not 55%. I think it's very, very important that academics, industry, everybody engages to try to understand what are the implications of this, how can this actually be done. As you heard our colleague from the wind sector in Ireland, 70% electricity by 2030. Now, 55% economy-wide reductions by 2030 would imply 70% reductions in Germany, economy-wide. 70%. They're at 30 today. So they would need to do more in the next 10 years than they've done in the last 30. I don't want to be the one saying we can't do this, we can't do that. This should be the product of a joint societal discussion. I'm just saying we need to have that discussion, and we need to find out what are the exact measures and where can they take us, because the ambition is important. We need to deliver on this, but it's also important that we don't, let's say, lose time and get bogged down in discussions over something that can't be done and lose sight of the long-term target. For me, the first priority in the next 5 years is getting the long-term target right. Then we need to adjust after that and see what needs to be done in that light for 2030. But it's really important that we lock in the long term. We already have a set of rules for 2030. So let's get the long term locked in, and then let's look at 2030. That would be my closing words. So thank you very much.